Welcome back to the Perek Project. Someone once asked a great rabbi called the Chedushe Harim for advice on how not to forget his Torah studies. And he looked at him and he said to him, "Tell me, do you ever forget how to eat? Do you perhaps put the food in your ear instead of your mouth?" And he says, "Of course not." Why? Because you realize that your life depends on it. When we realize that something is important, it helps us remember it. When we remember that the primary goal is that of developing our soul, it helps us remember the life-giving wisdom that Torah teaches us. And that's why Rab Dostai ben Yanai tells us that anyone that forgets anything of their Torah study, and he's talking here about someone who forgets because they don't review. When we learn the first time, there's a certain amount of learning that could be perhaps because it's the thrill of new knowledge. But when we review something, we show that we're dedicated to really understanding and applying the life-giving wisdom of Torah. And if a person forgets, and we're not talking here about someone who forgets because it was too difficult, but because of either indifference or laziness, and then we make wrong decisions based on that, that's not a case of ignorance is bliss, but that's a case of negligence. We could have done better had we known better. We're reminded again that Torah study is not just an intellectual pursuit, but it's there to teach us how to live a good and meaningful and happy life. And in Mishnah 11 and 12, Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa is going to give us the prerequisites for studying and maintaining our Torah wisdom. Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa was an incredible personality. Let me share with you two anecdotes from him. He had incredible faith in God. Once his daughter was lighting Shabbat candles and she realized that instead of filling them up with oil, she had filled them up with vinegar. And Rabbi Hanina turned around and said, "What's the big deal? Whoever told oil to burn will tell vinegar to burn." He recognized that everything comes from God. And just like God told the oil to burn, God could tell the vinegar to burn. And his daughter lit the Shabbat candles, and indeed they did burn. And he wasn't fazed by it because he had lived with that knowledge that everything comes from God. He was also someone who was incredibly poor. And once a person left a chicken outside his house. And the chicken hatched some eggs. And even though he was so incredibly poor, he didn't want to benefit from someone else's stuff. So he looked after that chicken and the eggs. And eventually, the chicken and the eggs made so much mess that what he did was he sold them. And he invested that money into buying goats and looked after, even though it wasn't his property. And even though he was so incredibly poor. Now, what does he tell us? He tells us that the prerequisite for wisdom is that a person has to have fear of sin. What does he mean by this? It means an awe of God, an awe of the holiness of God, and a fear of falling short of and letting ourselves and letting God down. Whenever we have a goal, the goal is always primary, and the means to getting to the goal is secondary. So what he's teaching us here is that the goal of not letting ourselves and God down, that fear of messing up, that fear of sin, has to be primary. And the wisdom is there to achieve the goal. So our fear of sin has to exceed our wisdom. And someone who has both is like someone who has both the skills and the tools needed in order to fulfill the job. And just like a person has to have a commitment to not sinning, to not messing up, we also have to have a commitment to fulfilling the positive mitzvot. And that's what he tells us in Mishnah 12. He says, anyone whose good deeds exceed their wisdom will last. What's interesting is that when a person puts tefillin on, first they put the tefillin on the hand, then they put the tefillin on the head. Now when they take it off, they do the opposite. First they take off the tefillin of the head, and then they take off the tefillin of the hand. Now the hand symbolizes action, whereas the head symbolizes knowledge. What it's teaching us here is that the tefillin of the head is never on without the tefillin of the hand, because wisdom on its own is only valuable when it translates into action. So it's telling us here that we have to have a commitment to doing good, the right thing, even if we don't yet understand why we should do the mitzvah. We should have a commitment to doing the right thing. Now you might ask, how on earth can our good deeds exceed our knowledge? Because you can't do something unless you first know about it. But we're told something that's fascinating, that when we commit to doing something, even though we haven't yet done it, but we hear about it and we commit to doing it, it is considered by God as though we have already completed it. And this applies to life wisdom too. Everything that we go through in life is sent to us for a reason. And we are supposed to not just learn from it, but we are supposed to take whatever we experience and translate it into action, so that we become not just wiser people, but also better people. Rabbi Saadia Gaon was one of the greatest rabbis of his generation, and he was once traveling and he stayed in an inn overnight. And the next morning, the innkeeper realized that he had been hosting someone of great status because he saw so many people coming to visit him. And he went to Rabbi Saadia Gaon and he said to him, "I want to ask you forgiveness." And Rabbi Saadia said, "Why? What did you do wrong? You treated me so well yesterday." He said, "I did nothing wrong, but had I realized who you were, I would have treated you even better." And Rabbi Saadia said, he was so inspired by those words. He says, that's how we are supposed to live our life. That everything that happens and everything that we learn has to be translated into action. That every day we say, today I know more, so I do better and I become better.